Starting seeds is one of my favorite parts of growing food. There's so much hope and anticipation in a little seed. You haven't made any mistakes yet. It's only just your mind, what you've seen on the seed catalog or a seed packet. You can just only hope for when you put this little seed in the ground, you're going to get something beautiful. And starting your own seeds really opens up a huge window of opportunity for you to choose different varieties that aren't available typically to purchase as transplants. Now, starting seeds can kind of be a little bit of a complicated topic for some people. Well, what do you put the seeds in? What kind of potting mix do I use? How many seeds do you put in a cell? All these questions can be answered. We're going to start with trying to unravel some of those complications. In order to do that, I've broken up this topic into two components. We have our requirements for a good start and requirements for continued growth. So looking at those two headings, we're going to start with requirements for a good start. We're going to start with our growing mix. Now, a growing mix is basically just a type of material that you're going to put your seeds in that's going to make for a great environment for your roots to thrive and your seeds to grow. Growing mixes used to be really hard to come by. It used to be something where you either had to make your own or you had to know somebody who made their own to get a really great and powerful organic growing mix. Well, that's not the case anymore. There's a lot of companies out there that are making really professional, high-quality growing mixes available at major hardware stores. My favorite growing mix comes from a place called Vermont Compost Company. This company is out of Vermont. They take food waste that they collect from their community. They make it into a really rich, high-quality compost, and then they blend it with things like peat moss and vermiculite and granite and things like that to make a growing mix that's unparalleled. It has enough fertility naturally to sustain a plant for 12 weeks even. This is an example right here. This is Vermont Compost potting mix. As you can see, it's nice and fluffy. It's got the perfect balance of all the different types of materials. And it doesn't look like it, but this stuff has enough fertility to bring your plants into a super healthy stage where you can plant them in the garden and even add some fertility to your garden once you've planted it. Hey, thanks for taking the time to watch this video lesson. If you like what you've seen so far, consider enrolling in our full online course. It's available at organicgardeningclass.com, or you can visit the link in the description below. Now, this is just one of 30 lessons that I go through in our course. It goes from start to finish, seed to table. We go through the 4 pillars of successful organic gardening. Now, if that's something that sounds right up your alley, go ahead and click the link in the description or go to organicgardeningclass.com. And right now, I'm offering 50% off the full course. That code is springtime50. If you go to the checkout page and right there where it asks for the promo code, type in springtime50 and you'll get half off full lifetime access to the course. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the lesson. Now, if you're really set on making your own mix, you can do so. It's really just a combination of peat moss, perlite, vermiculite, sometimes coco coir, some fertilizers, some green sands. There's a really great mix recipe that we're going to include for you in the notes. If you're feeling mad scientist or you really want to just get your hands dirty in making your own mix, please feel free. It's actually a great learning experience because you get to learn that no matter how hard you try, you're never going to make a mix as good as these guys at Vermont Compost. So if you don't have access to Vermont Compost Company and you want to go to the store and you want to just buy a mix, there's also plenty of options out there. If you can find anything from Purple Cow Organics or any of the Humboldt nutrient group, things like there's these crazy sounding brands, Coco Loco and Happy Frog and things like that. Typically, if you have a store in your town that sells hydroponic supplies for growing indoors, they have a lot of these materials that have really great options for organic growing mixes. What you really just want to stay away from is you want to stay away from growing mixes that don't have any fertility in them or that have non-organic fertility in them, things like Miracle Grow or any of those other ones that already have like the little fertilizer balls that are going to slow release, things for your hydrangeas or impatiens or things like that. While those will produce growth and good results for some types of plants, You really don't want to put them when you're starting your seeds. That fertilizer can be a little intense for them. Plus, it's really just spoon feeding those little plants, and they're not having to really do much work in order to build up its own stores of nutrients. So go for the organic stuff. Get your hands on some Vermont compost potting mix if possible, and you can get it shipped to your door. If you want to go for a big 2 cubic yard bag, you can get that trucked to your farm as well, your house. Now, if you go to a big hardware store or your local hardware store and you want to find your own potting mix and you don't want to go with the Vermont compost, make your own, just look for something that's organic, approved for organic use. It'll have the OMRI approved letters on the OMRI, which stands for the Organic Materials Review Institute. If you're using it to start seeds, very early on, you can use a mix that doesn't have any fertility in it. It's just a bland, no fertility mix. But as those seeds start to grow and you start to pot those seeds up, you're going to need something that's going to have fertility in it. So a little bit of organic fertilizer. You need to just make sure that if you're going to grow those plants for a decent amount of time in the greenhouse or in your house, you're going to need some sort of fertility, unless you're going to add your own. So just make sure that you have that in consideration when you're choosing the bagged potting mix. But there are a lot of good options out there. Just to make sure you look for ones that are organic, so they have organic sources, and you should be good. Now that we've talked about growing mix, that's just the first part. Containment is the second part. Now, with containment, it's really just you've got to put your growing mix in something. You can't just have a pile of dirt on a table and put your seed in there. You have to contain it, and you have to make sure that you can move it around if you need to. So in order to do that, it can take the shape, it can take many forms. It can be as official as these little 4 cell pack thingamajigs right here, where you can easily just fill it with some soil, drop your seeds in, and put it in a little tray that they sell. You can buy these at any hardware store. I think you can buy them at Lowe's and Home Depot and things like that as well. They also sell some that are all connected, so you have a big tray kind of like this. But it doesn't have to be this official. It could be something as simple as an egg carton. This egg carton is one of the pulp egg cartons, and it will seep water out, it will leak, so be careful if you have this and you have it on your countertop or something like that inside. It will leak water on your counter and be a mess. You can put a little tray underneath it. If you're going to use a styrofoam egg carton or a plastic egg carton, one thing you need to really be sure of is that you poke holes in the bottom so water can drain out, or else you're going to have some issues of standing water, and that's not a good situation for trying to grow seeds, plants from seed. So it can be unofficial, it can be reused recycled K-cups. It can be yogurt cups, which are not quite the size of this, but they all accomplish basically the same thing, which is a place to put your potting mix while you're growing your seeds. There are things that you can buy at the store that are like these pre-packed, compressed peat moss that you just add water and they swell up. Those can be okay, but they're not going to last that long as far as fertility is concerned. You're going to have to really watch them, and your plants may not get off to the best start. So I always prefer a really well-blended, well-made, compost-based potting mix that's got plenty of fertility in it, that you can put in any container you want, but something that's going to keep it, contained and movable. The third element for a good start is temperature. So we've talked about your potting mix. We've talked about something to put it in, and the temperature is another very important part. Seeds have a varying range of temperatures that they germinate best in. If you can imagine a graph, over here would be low temperatures, over here would be high temperatures, and you have the percentage of germination. The graph kind of goes like this, like an upside down check mark. Really what that represents is the hotter the temperature, to a certain degree, the better it germinates. The colder the temperature, the worse or slower it germinates. With things like tomatoes and peppers, you need a good 75 to 85 degrees to make sure that seed germinates well. If you're only growing in 50 degrees, if the soil is only 50 degrees, it's not going to germinate that well. Also, if you get over that temperature range in the 95, 100 degrees, you're also going to suffer big time. The effectiveness drops off quite a bit pretty quickly. So you don't need it too hot, you don't need it too cold, you need it kind of just right. The ambient temperature of a house is great for most things. Peppers, eggplant, tomatoes, summer crops like that, they benefit from a little bit higher temperature. Putting it on top of your refrigerator or somewhere that gets nice and warm can be a great way to start your seeds. But you got to make sure that you don't let them grow too much because they need to be exposed to light as soon as possible. One thing that I like to use sometimes if I'm concerned about the temperature of my soil and I want to make it a little bit warmer is a heat mat. You can use a germination heat mat or a heat mat of some kind where the thermostat is controlled, where you can set your trays or whatever you're starting your seeds in, you can set it right on top of that, and you stick a little thermometer probe inside of the soil that you just sowed your seed into, and it will actually control the heat of your germination mat. It'll turn it on when it gets too cool, it'll turn it off when it gets too hot. It's a really great way of controlling temperature when you're really trying to get that optimum germination. After you figured out what kind of temperature your seeds need, a lot of times, like we said, ambient temperature of a household is perfect. You need to look at your moisture. So a potting mix needs to be not dry, but not sopping wet. Kind of like before, you want it so that when you squeeze it, it doesn't pour water out, but it still kind of holds its form. Really, a good thorough watering once a day is perfect for growing seeds. And when you put your seeds in trays, you want to make sure that the soil is completely moist evenly throughout all of your container. And then sometimes it's helpful to put some kind of a plastic on top of the seed, on top of where you've put the seed, to maintain your humidity in there. Saran wrap works fine. A little sheet of plastic or a plastic lid of a Pyrex can work fine. But something to maintain your humidity so that your seed stays moist during its whole period when it's germinating. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you skip days watering, if your soil media gets too dry, you're likely to have spotty germination. You really need to make sure that there's consistent water in your germinating mix, and that it stays moist but not too wet. And if you just keep in mind, if you've missed days and if it gets too dry, you are going to have spotty germination. One way to get around that is using a bottom watering system. It's basically just a tray. Imagine like a cafeteria tray or a cookie sheet or something like that, and put your tray in it and and then fill it with some water. So put the water in the cookie sheet or anything with the sides, so that basically your tray is sitting in some sort of water in a tray where it's contained. And what that'll do is that'll draw moisture up from the bottom of the tray, and it'll keep that soil moist. And you want to do that just enough so that your soil gets adequately moist, and then you can dump the excess water out of that tray. But that's a good way, because then moisture comes up from the bottom, and the root, as it germinates, it goes down to the bottom of that tray where the moisture is, instead of having the water from the top all the time. So it's just one way to really ensure that you have adequate moisture in your seedling trays. Those are the 4 components of the requirements that I've identified for a good start. Now, for continued growth, you need 3 things. We've got light, we got water, and root space. Let's start with the first one. Once seedlings emerge from a potting mix, they're going to search for light right away. If they don't find that, they're going to keep getting taller and taller and taller until they do. Well, if there's no light, they're just going to keep getting taller and taller until they decide to just flop over. Those are called leggy plants, and those plants will never perform the way they're supposed to, and you've got to throw them away. So it's very important, as our seedlings emerge, to make sure that it's either got access to direct sunlight or very intense light from inside of a house. If you don't have those things, you're going to have to set up some kind of artificial light. And this is an example of artificial light. This is just simply a fluorescent light, something you would put in your shop. It's not an LED. It's very important not to get an LED light, but a regular old fluorescent bulb, because that's going to provide the right spectrum of light for your plants. Now, all you have to do is set this up about 12 inches above where your seedlings are growing, and you can get a smaller than that. You don't have to get a real big long one. They sell them in smaller versions. Set that up right where you're growing, and that'll be plenty of light for your plants to get nice and established. When plants have enough light, they end up getting broad instead of getting tall, and you want them to get broad because that's what they're designed to do. They're designed to send out these solar panels to start collecting energy from sunlight in order to produce growth. My recommendation is if you don't have your own little greenhouse that you can build outside, or a room that the light shines directly in, if you're going to start your seeds indoors, my recommendation is to go and buy a little fluorescent light to have right above your seeds so that they can get a good size before you have to put them outside. After we have our light taken care of, the water is one of the most essential components. Plants that don't have enough water are not going to be able to send out their roots into the remainder of their growing space, their containment, and so they're never going to be able to access all of the nutrients that are available. They're going to be far more stunted than the rest. I've done experiments where I've had plants that I've sown on the same day. One gets plenty of water, one does not get enough water. It gets a decent amount, enough to keep it alive, but not enough to make it thrive, and the growth difference can be more than double for the ones that do get the water. So water is very, very important. I've always found that when I'm watering plants, it's helpful. This is one of my trays of zucchini, and when I'm taking a watering wand over this, or a watering can, you want to make sure that the water is getting evenly on the entire spot. So if you had your egg carton, for example, you want to just make sure that you're watering the entire thing evenly, and you want to kind of envision the water seeping down into the growing mix and reaching the bottom of the cell. If you can do that once a day, that's not too much, that's the perfect amount, once a day of a good thorough soaking, then your plants will have plenty to continue growing. If you just water the surface and the water doesn't get down all the way to the bottom of your cell, what's going to end up happening is you're going to stimulate a lot of growth on the very top of your actual soil in the form of a little bit of an algae, and that will cause your soil to dry out quicker, and it can cause problems down the road. So one thorough soaking once a day is all you need. Speaking about root space, once your plants get to a certain size, they either need to be put outside or they need to be potted up into a bigger container. So an example of this would be, let's say we have these tomatoes right here. So these tomato plants are ready to be potted up. You can tell that a number of ways. Number one is just how big they are in comparison to the size of the cell. Number two, if I just pull it, it comes right out, and you can notice all the roots that are kind of winding around this mass of potting mix. So what's happened is the roots have found the edge of their containment area, and they've made a hard left turn or right turn, and they're searching for a new spot to access. So these tomatoes are the perfect size to pot up. They could actually be potted up a little bit sooner. And if you didn't want to just put these out in your garden and you wanted to get them a little bit bigger because maybe it's not the right time of year, maybe there's still danger of frost, it's pretty simple. You'll take a container like this. You'll just take your potting mix. Make a little hole. Pull your plant, pop it in the hole, and you're done. So what you've done is you've just taken what didn't have enough root space and you've given it enough root space. This plant, if left in this, will grow to a massive size. These plants should probably just be put in the garden, but like I said, if it's not quite time, you can buy yourself a lot more time by just putting it into a little bit bigger container. We've talked a lot about all the different components. Let's start some seeds. So what we're going to do, you have to have a couple different things in place before we get really started. You've got to make a plan. If you sit down with some seed packets and you say, I'm going to sow seeds today, and you just decide you're going to sow a whole bunch of seeds, well, you're number one, you might have a lot of fun, but number one, you're going to be sowing way too many plants to put in your garden, so you have to give some away, which may not be the worst thing, but you just got to know what you're getting yourself into. One of the reasons that our planning lesson is so important is when you can understand how many seeds you're going to need per planting, you can then say, okay, today is March 11th or whatever it is. I need 12 squash plants. I need to start 12 squash plants today. So if we were going to start 12 squash plants today, we obviously have a 12 container of this egg carton. And once we've got our plan and we've gathered our supplies, so we've got our potting mix, we've got our container, we've got our seeds. Let's find our seeds. I found our seeds. So these are summer squash, some zucchini right here. I need to sow 12 today. So I'm going to do it in this egg carton. I'm also going to show another example of another kind of seed in a little bit different style container. So it's easy as this. You take your potting mix, you put it in your container, and it benefits as you're filling your container. It kind of benefits from a little bit of compaction because this stuff is really loose and friable. So if you can pack your potting mix down there a little bit, it's really going to be good for the structure of the potting mix, and your seeds are going to benefit in the long run. So we've got our nice leveled off, ready to go. You'll take a finger and just kind of make little divots. Very simple. And we have our summer squash seeds here. And I love summer squash seeds because they're huge. These are the kinds of things that look like pumpkin seeds, and pumpkins and squash are very similar. So once we've got our squash seeds, just take them and drop them one at a time. About a ½ inch down into our soil. Make sure they're in there. And in situations like this, you can even just kind of tap on it and it just lightly covers. And we're going to set this aside, but we're going to water it in before we're all finished with all of our seeding. So that literally took about 5 seconds to drop all those seeds, and all told, maybe 30 seconds to put our squash seeds in. Now, another kind of seed that we often find is a lot smaller seed. And if you have a lot smaller seed, a lot of times it's helpful to go for a cell or a type of container that's a lot smaller, because with all that watering you're going to do to the cell, if you use, for instance, a container like this for a seed that's only the size of a mustard grain, then by the time that plant gets to be big enough, you're going to have washed a lot of your nutrients out of this mix. So one thing that's really helpful is just use a smaller cell. The smaller the seed, the smaller the cell, and then if you really want to, you can bump this up into a larger cell if you need to buy yourself more time, or if you think the plant needs to be bigger before it goes out into your garden. So in the same way, I'm just going to sow a few of these right here, not have to do the whole thing. So we'll just empty our potting mix into our cells right here. Drop it in. And I'm going to use the old 3-finger method to do this real quickly. This is Bok Choy. I love Bok Choy, mainly because other people love it, but it's also delicious. And for these, there's a lot of these little fancy seeding mechanisms out there, things that you can tap or things that you can, that suck up the exact amount of seeds and divvy it in there. I've always been a fan of the old finger roll. And what I mean is you just kind of twist these in your fingers until one drops out. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and sometimes 2 will fall in there. And it's really not a big deal if 2 seeds fall in a cell, because you can always pull one out later. The weakest one, 2, 1, and away we go. Doesn't have to be super precise. I like to only drop 1 per cell, but if I drop 2, it is what it is. Now, one thing to note here is on seed packets, we're going to see a germination percentage. And this germination percentage means that these seeds were tested before they were sold, And when they sowed these seeds, 99% of them germinated well and came up. So that means I'm only going to need 1 seed per cell. It's not always 99% germination. Sometimes it's 80% germination. In those cases, I like to add 2 or 3 seeds so that it's got more of a chance of every single cell being germinated and little seeds coming up. But just keep that in mind. So we've got all this in there. Sometimes I'll grab a little bit of extra, put it in, and we're good to go. Now, if we were to plant those tiny seeds directly into the ground, they might do okay, but there's a lot of things that it has working against it. You've got all the elements, you've got the heat, you've got the rain, it could be picked off by an animal. And so if we can give that tiny seed a protected area to grow for a certain amount of time until it can get its roots established and get enough leaves where when we put it out, it's going to be able to handle life out in the field, it's going to do a lot better. So it's not that you can't direct seed all of your crops, it's just that you're going to have a lot better success if you start some in a more protected area and then transplant it out as a teenage plant that can handle the world. Just like we bumped up this, I've got some lettuce that I want to bump up. And these are little lettuce plants that we had that could get put in the ground. These are romaine lettuce. They could go in the ground, but I need to buy a little bit more time. My space isn't quite ready yet, and you might find yourself in the same situation where you've got a garden bed that you're going to plant these romaines in, but currently it's occupied by something else. So instead of letting these get too big and root bound and unhealthy, you can just put them in a bigger cell. So here we go. And it's very simple. A lot of people try to be very dainty and ginger with plants. They'll recover, they'll be fine. Just push them right in there. And there we go. Once this gets some water, those roots will take right off and these plants will be super happy. So it's pretty simple. That's it. You've got your supplies, you've got something to put them in, you've got your growing mix. You really just have to consider what temperature it's going to germinate at, and once it does germinate, how will you get it some light? If you don't have light in your house, like I said, you need to put it in, you need to have some artificial light, or you need to put it outside. But if you give it enough root space, a good growing mix, good light, and good water, you're going to have a beautiful transplant before you know it, and you're going to be ready to put it in the garden and have something to really look at.